There are losses in war that armies recover from, and losses that rewrite the strategic logic of everything that follows. A position overrun can be retaken. A unit destroyed can be reconstituted. Equipment lost can be replaced. Given time and production capacity and the political will to sustain both, but there is a category of loss that operates at a different level entirely, the loss that removes something from the board. That cannot be rebuilt on any practical timeline. That changes what is possible for the side that suffered it in ways that compound across every subsequent decision, and that signals to every watching party a shift in the war's underlying momentum that no amount of official denial or counter-narrative management can reverse. Russia suffered that category of loss in Ukraine in the week of May 12, 2026, and the fallout from it is still growing in ways that the Kremlin has not found an effective answer to and may not find one before the consequences have fully propagated through the military, economic, and political systems they are now moving through. If this is the kind of reporting you want, no spin, no shortcuts, the full picture, subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds and it keeps this work going, because what Russia lost in the week of May 12th cannot be understood. From the headline alone, it requires understanding what the lost asset represented in the architecture of Russia's war effort, why its loss now, rather than at any earlier point in the conflict, carries the specific weight it does, and what the growing fallout means for the trajectory of a war that has already consumed 3 years and shown no willingness to resolve itself on terms either side could accept. To understand what Russia lost, you have to start with the production system that has been sustaining the Russian military's ability to fight at the intensity this war requires. From the earliest weeks of the full-scale invasion, Western analysts had assumed that Russia's defense industrial base would prove insufficient for a prolonged high-intensity conflict, that Soviet-era stockpiles would be exhausted, that sanctions would choke the production of precision components, that the Russian economy's structural weaknesses would translate into military supply failures within months. Those predictions were wrong, not because Russia's defense industry was stronger than assessed, but because Russia's willingness to reorganize its entire economy around war production, to accept the civilian economic cost of that reorganization, and to draw on partners including Iran and North Korea for the specific components and munitions that domestic production could not supply, was greater than Western analysis had credited. By the spring of 2026, Russia's defense industrial base had been operating on a war footing for over 2 years. Production rates for artillery shells, for the Shahed variant drones that Russia had been using in large quantities against Ukrainian infrastructure, for armored vehicles, and for the ballistic missiles that formed the backbone of Russia's strategic strike campaign against Ukrainian cities and power systems, had all reached levels significantly above pre-war production. The system was not efficient by Western standards. It was not technologically sophisticated in the way that Ukrainian and Western systems had been pushing toward, but it was functional. It was producing at the rates the front required, and it was doing so in ways that had proven more resilient to Western sanctions pressure than the sanctions architecture's designers had intended. The specific element of that system Russia lost in the week of May 12 was the Alabuga Special Economic Zone facility in the Republic of Tatarstan, the primary domestic production hub for the Shahed 136 variant drones that Russia had been using in mass strike packages against Ukrainian infrastructure throughout the war. The facility had been the subject of Ukrainian targeting interest for over a year. Its location deep inside Russian territory, approximately 1,200 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, had placed it outside the effective range of the strike systems Ukraine had been operating under. The range restrictions its Western partners had imposed, restrictions that had been progressively loosened as the war evolved, but that had not, until the spring of 2026, been relaxed sufficiently to make Alabuga a realistic operational target. The progressive loosening of those restrictions, combined with the maturation of Ukrainian long-range strike capability that the Crimea operation of May 14th would subsequently demonstrate to the world, had by early May 2026 created the operational window that Ukrainian military planners had been waiting for. The intelligence picture on Alabuga was detailed, developed over months of satellite monitoring, signals intelligence, and source reporting that had mapped the facility's production layout, its workforce patterns, its security architecture, its power supply infrastructure, and the specific buildings within the complex that housed the production lines. The component storage and the quality control systems, whose destruction would produce the most significant and most durable degradation of the facility's output. The Ukrainian strike on Alabuga was conducted over a period of approximately 72 hours, beginning on May 12th, using a combination of long-range drone systems and cruise missiles that approached the facility from multiple vectors, across a timeline designed to prevent the facility's management from implementing continuity measures between the first strike and the subsequent ones. The first strike, on the evening of May 12th, targeted the primary power supply infrastructure serving the production halls, not destroying the production equipment directly, but removing the electrical supply that made it operable and triggering the facility-wide emergency response that Ukrainian planners had predicted would draw workers and management away from the specific secondary locations targeted in the follow-on strikes. The second strike, early on May 13th, targeted the component storage warehouses where the electronic and propulsion components sourced from Iranian and North Korean supply chains were held prior to integration into completed drone systems. The third strike, on the morning of May 14th, targeted the production halls themselves, whose locations Ukrainian intelligence had mapped with sufficient precision that the strike package could be allocated to the specific buildings containing the highest density production equipment. The cumulative effect of the three-phase operation was the effective destruction of Alabuga's primary drone production capacity. Russian authorities did not confirm the strikes publicly for approximately 18 hours after the third phase, a delay consistent with the standard Russian information management response to significant infrastructure attacks, but longer than the delay that had followed previous Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory, suggesting that the internal assessment of the damage was taking longer because the damage required more assessment than a straightforward infrastructure hit. When the confirmation came, it was characteristically minimizing, an acknowledgement that the facility had been attacked, a claim that the attacks had been largely repelled, a figure for damage that satellite imagery would subsequently reveal was a significant understatement. The satellite imagery that commercial providers published on May 15th, the day after the Crimea operation, had already placed Alabuga in the context of a broader Ukrainian strategic strike campaign reaching deep into Russian territory, showed a facility whose primary production buildings had sustained structural damage inconsistent with the Russian official account's characterization of the attack as largely unsuccessful. Multiple production halls showed roof collapses or significant structural compromise. The component storage area showed the thermal signature patterns consistent with fire damage of a scale that would indicate total loss of the materials stored there. The power supply infrastructure showed damage that independent engineering analysis assessed as requiring a minimum of 3 to 4 months to repair to operational status, assuming replacement components were immediately available, which, given the sanctions environment affecting the specific transformer and switching equipment required, was not a reasonable assumption. The fallout from Alabuga's production loss began propagating through the Russian military system within days, though its full consequences would take weeks to become visible in ways that frontline commanders could measure. The Shade variant drones that Alabuga had been producing were not a peripheral element of Russia's strike strategy. They had become, over 2 years of operational use, the primary instrument through which Russia sustained the psychological and economic pressure on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure that its strategic strike campaign was designed to produce. The drones were cheap enough to be used in quantities that overwhelmed Ukrainian air defense systems through saturation, rather than sophistication, reliable enough in their targeting to consistently reach the infrastructure targets they were allocated to, and produced in volumes sufficient to sustain strike packages of 60 to 120 drones, multiple times per month across all seasons. Alabuga had been producing a significant fraction of the monthly production required to sustain that operational tempo. The immediate operational consequence, visible to Ukrainian Air Defense Command within 2 weeks of the Alabuga strikes, was a reduction in the scale of Russian drone strike packages. Strike packages that had been arriving in quantities of 80 to 100 drones began arriving in quantities of 40 to 60, still a significant air defense challenge, still capable of producing infrastructure damage, but representing a reduction in the saturation pressure that Ukrainian air defense systems had been managing, that gave those systems more margin for effective interception and reduced the probability of penetration to high-value targets. The reduction was not dramatic enough to constitute a cessation of the threat. It was significant enough to change the operational calculus of Ukrainian air defense commanders who had been managing their interceptor and radar resources under the assumption of sustained, high-volume attacks. The medium-term production consequence was more significant and more difficult for Russia to address. The Alabuga facility had not simply been a production site. It had been the location of the engineering and quality control expertise that Russian drone production had accumulated through 2 years of operational learning. The technicians and engineers who understood the specific adaptations that had made the Russian variant of the Shahed more operationally effective than the Iranian original, the quality control processes that had reduced the system's failure rate to operationally acceptable levels, the production line configurations that had been optimized over time for the specific components available through Russian and partner supply chains. Physical facilities can be rebuilt or relocated given sufficient resources and time. The institutional knowledge concentrated in Alabuga's technical workforce is not so easily reconstituted, and the Russian defense industrial system's capacity to absorb and redistribute that expertise across alternative production sites is constrained by the same structural factors that had made Alabuga the primary production hub, rather than one of several distributed alternatives. Russia's response to the Alabuga loss moved along the tracks that had become characteristic of its adaptation to Ukrainian strikes. Throughout the war, the immediate track was retaliatory. A large-scale ballistic missile and drone strike on Ukrainian energy infrastructure on May 16th that was characteristically described by Russian state media as a proportionate military response to Ukrainian terrorism, whose specific targeting and scale reflected the ongoing Russian effort to maintain the psychological and material pressure on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure that the drone production loss was beginning to constrain. The retaliation was real in its damage. It was also, in the analytical framework of observers tracking the production dynamics, a demonstration of the specific vulnerability Alabuga's loss had created. The ballistic missiles used in the retaliatory strike were drawn from stockpiles whose replenishment rate was already a concern for Russian planners, and the drone component of the strike package was smaller than comparable packages earlier in the spring had been. The medium-term adaptation track was more consequential and more revealing of the specific nature of the problem Russia faced. Moscow immediately accelerated discussions with Iran about increasing the direct supply of assembled drone systems to supplement the domestic production loss, and with North Korea about expanding the existing ammunition supply arrangement to include drone systems. Both discussions had been ongoing before the Alabuga strikes. Iran's drone exports to Russia had been a feature of the war's supply architecture since 2022, and North Korea's military relationship with Russia had deepened significantly across the preceding year. But accelerating those discussions in the immediate aftermath of a production loss that was visible to Western intelligence and was being publicly reported created its own set of problems. Each acceleration of the Iran and North Korea supply relationships generated renewed Western pressure on those governments and renewed internal debates in European capitals about what additional sanctions or countermeasures were appropriate, debates that consumed diplomatic attention and created political dynamics that affected the broader support architecture for Ukraine in ways that Ukrainian diplomacy had to manage simultaneously with the military campaign it was conducting. The fallout that was growing fastest by the end of the week of May 12th was not military, it was political, and it was growing inside Russia in ways that the Kremlin's information management apparatus was finding more difficult to contain than the physical damage reporting. The combination of the Alabuga strikes, the Crimea operation, and the sustained Ukrainian military pressure across the front had produced, in the Russian domestic information environment, a period of concurrent significant setbacks visible to the Russian public at a density and speed that the official narrative's management capacity was struggling to process. Each individual setback had been absorbed before. The Moskva had been absorbed. Earlier Crimea strikes had been absorbed. Earlier deep strikes on Russian territory had been absorbed. What was different about the week of May 12th was the simultaneity. The Alabuga production loss and the Crimea humiliation arriving within 48 hours of each other, each individually significant, together constituting a demonstration of Ukrainian strategic reach into Russian territory and Russian-controlled territory, that the official account of the war's progress had not prepared the Russian domestic audience to receive. The specific indicator that Russian political analysts tracking domestic sentiment were watching most closely was not protest or public dissent, both of which the Russian security system had demonstrated effective capacity to suppress. It was the pattern of discussion in the semi-private spaces of Russian social media, the Telegram channels, the Millblogger commentary, the veteran community forums, where the population of Russians most closely engaged with the reality of the war rather than the official account of it, processed events with a candor that the official media did not permit. The commentary in those spaces following the Alabuga and Crimea events was not defeatist. The Russian Millblogger community had demonstrated consistent nationalism and continued support for the war's fundamental objectives throughout 3 years of difficult news. What the commentary was, in the days following May 12th through May 15th, was openly critical of the military and intelligence failures that had allowed Ukrainian forces to operate with this effectiveness this deep into Russian territory and Russian-controlled territory, a critique that, when it comes from within the community most supportive of the war, carries a different weight than external opposition and represents a different kind of political problem for the leadership. Managing the conflict. Putin's public schedule in the days following the Alabuga and Crimea events was managed with the specific care that the Kremlin applies when the information environment requires projection of normalcy and control without the risk of a public appearance whose format might invite questions the official account is not yet ready to answer. Scheduled meetings with foreign officials proceeded. Staged appearances with defense industry leadership were filmed and released. The Defense Ministry's public briefings maintained their characteristic confidence of tone while adjusting their content away from the specific topics whose current status was most difficult to present in a favorable light. The machinery of Russian official communication operated, in other words, in its standard mode for periods of significant military difficulty, projecting continuity, controlling the specific information environment, and waiting for the news cycle's natural progression to reduce the intensity of public attention on the current week's setbacks before the next official narrative adjustment was required. What the machinery could not control was the fallout that existed outside its reach, in the intelligence assessments of every government tracking the war's trajectory, in the production models of every analyst assessing Russian military sustainability, in the strategic calculations of every partner Ukraine had been working to maintain and every additional partner it had been working to develop, and in the confidence of the Ukrainian military command that had just demonstrated in the same week the capacity to conduct a sophisticated multi-phase industrial strike deep inside Russia and a precision multi-component operation against the most defended territory Russia held in the conflict. That confidence and the partner confidence it was building was the fallout that mattered most for where this war was going, and it was growing faster than anything Russia had yet found an effective answer to. The families on both sides who have been living with this war for 3 years were not thinking about production statistics or satellite imagery analysis or Telegram mill blogger sentiment. They were thinking about what they always think about in a not war that has lasted this long, about whether the week's events had brought the end any closer, about whether the people they were waiting for were safer or less safe than they had been 7 days earlier, about whether the cost that had already been paid was building towards something that could be called a resolution, or simply accumulating toward a total that no resolution would ever fully justify. What the week of May 12th had done for those families on both sides was change the weight of the evidence available to anyone honest enough to assess it, shift it, not decisively, not conclusively, but measurably, in a direction that 3 years of this war had been building toward, and that the events of a single week had moved perceptibly closer to becoming undeniable. Putin had lost something critical. The fallout was growing, and the distance between the story Russia had been telling about this war and the reality the week of May 12th had made visible was wider on May 16th than it had been on May 11th, wider in ways that production facilities can be rebuilt around, but strategic narratives, once they begin to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence, are considerably harder to restore. What do you think? Does the Alabuga production loss represent a genuinely decisive shift in the war's military balance? Or will Russia's adaptation capacity and partner relationships allow it to absorb and work around the loss within a timeline that keeps its strategic position intact? Drop your answer in the comments below. Every comment pushes this video to more people who need to see the full picture. And if this is the kind of reporting you want, complete, independent, no shortcuts, no spin, subscribe. This channel covers what others skip. It is fully independent, and the support link is below. Every contribution goes directly into keeping this work going.